Our Bible reading this morning should be coming up on the screen. There we go. So it's Luke chapter 14 to start with. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honour at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honour, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come to you and say, "Give this person your seat." Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you will be honoured in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives or your rich neighbours. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous."
Morning all. Once again, welcome to the Sunday morning service of Margate Christian Church. My name is Matt and I'm one of the leaders here. And again, I'd like to welcome you in Jesus' name. Really glad that you can make it this morning. I'm going to be continuing our sermon series on head, heart and habits. Hopefully you'll recall, if you've been along to a couple of these before, that the series is looking at ways that we can use habits, routines, just really the stuff of everyday or every week life to help close the gap, if you like, between the spirituality that we often talk about and aspire to and espouse and the spirituality that we actually live in the day-to-day. And this is really based on the idea that the Holy Spirit, God working inside us, can change our emotions, our attitudes, our thought life through the actual concrete things that we do. Our actions, if you like. It's really a reminder that we're not just bubbleheads as followers of Jesus. We're not just, as other people have said, we're not just brains on sticks. We don't just think our way into changing who we are. We also act our way into that as well. You may be familiar with the verse that we're renewed we're transformed by the renewing of our mind. And that's true, but I don't think that's the whole story of Scripture either. Jesus said, "Come follow me." He didn't just say, "Think about me, consider my ideas." He said, "Come follow me." And you may be familiar, I think it was in the church of Antioch, so some of the earliest Christians recorded in the book of Acts, they were known as followers of the way, before the Mandalorian made that cool. I think particularly as moderns who live in such affluence, it's just so easy to overthink our spirituality, our Christianity. We can overthink it. It can remain way too heady. And the risk of that, of course, is that the thinking can become an excuse for not doing. Does that make sense? We can overthink things and we just don't do the stuff that we need, that we know that we should be doing. So yeah, our actions, what we do, our habits, our routines, the stuff of everyday life, it matters and it changes us. It forms us into people through God's help. So far in this series, we've looked at prayer, we've looked at Bible reading, we've looked at all of life organisation. Today, we're going to be looking at the very concrete, the very daily act of eating and drinking. And specifically, we're going to be looking at eating and drinking with other people. But first, I'm wondering if any of you guys have heard about the now long-term Harvard study on the factors that lead to healthy and happy lives. So this has been making, I think, different podcasts and the press over the last couple of weeks or months. So it's a 75-plus-year-old study that kicked off in 1938 with a bunch of Harvard students, 268 male students back in 1938. And then that blossomed to include their wives and over time their children, their grandchildren. And over the decades, the cohort has expanded. But it's collected all this really useful data over the course of, again, 75 plus years. And here's one of the biggest headlines from the study. Close relationships, more than money or fame, are what keep people happy throughout their lives. Close relationships, more than money or fame, are what keep people happy throughout their lives. Close relationships, so the quality of our intimate relationships, are better predictors of long and happy lives than social class, IQ, or even our genes. And that is across the board of more than 1,300 participants over time. One of the researchers said, when we gathered everything together we knew about them at age 50, the participants, it wasn't their middle-age cholesterol levels that predicted how they were going to grow old. It was how satisfied they were in their relationships. The people who were most satisfied in their relationships at 50 were the healthiest at age 80. He also said, or wrote, loneliness kills. Loneliness kills. It's as powerful as smoking or alcoholism. So one thing that I took away from that is that it's probably a bad thing if someone says your life resembles a character in a country and western song, a classic country and western song. If you're lonely and you're smoking and you're drinking, you're in big trouble. So loneliness kills. It's as powerful as smoking or alcoholism. So our connections really matter. They really matter. They have real world effects on our life. Now, of course, there's lots of generalizations there. And that's just one study, et cetera, so take that all with a grain of salt. But this stuff makes a whole lot of sense to me. It squares away with my intuition, at least. We are social creatures. We need to know and be known. We need to love and be loved. But as we've said before in this series, relationships take time. Nothing can be loved at speed. Even the relatively simple and everyday rituals of eating together with those under your roof, which is a great way to love and be loved. This almost seems like preparing for an extreme sport event these days. Well, I'm not sure about some of you here, but for us, for our family, later afternoons and evenings can be both hectic and harried. At least 3 days out of the working regular 5, both Louis and myself are working. And I know that that's probably like the exception these days. For most parents our age or younger, my guess is that the majority of them work full-time, both work full-time. And then you've got after-school activities, you've got the swimming lessons, the soccer practices, etc. And then you throw in the homework on top of that once the kids get old enough. And then cleaning up the leftover mess that was made from breakfast and perhaps lunch. It can be such a hassle just to all eat together. And it can be even enough of a barrier just to go with the path of least resistance, which turns into, here's your meal and your favourite TV show over here, here's your meal and your favourite device over here. And now mum and dad are going to prep their meal and we're going to eat it separately at the bench, or maybe even a separate room, or maybe even next door for the extra serenity. Even all that, like that path of least resistance, can seem so hard, let alone coordinating all the members of your household to stop, sit down and eat together, minus TV and devices. And that's just trying to coordinate your family, the people who live under your roof. It can feel like a whole other level to then consider inviting someone else into that as well. Now, like I said, this is often our experience and it's probably common, but I don't think that makes it inevitable, let alone ideal. Here's what Justin Whitmill Early had to say about the humble mealtime. He's an author that we've referred to a couple of times in this series. In a culture of busyness, we seem to have made a strange flip. The solitary feeling of individual productivity and accomplishment is the necessity. Time to stop and eat with others, that's a luxury these days. So he's focusing on individual productivity and accomplishment, to which I would also add, in our context, a family's productivity and accomplishment. For those of us who live in that family environment at the moment, we often experience it as being super busy because we want our families to experience and achieve so much. I think it's fair to say, again, for most of us in that stage of life, we carry really high expectations of our families. So, regularly stopping to eat and drink with others. Both those people you live with and those who you don't. That's what we'll be looking at today. We're going to begin with some reasons why it's important and then offer some hopefully practical suggestions for implementing it. So first of all, some reasons. Why does this stuff matter so much beyond the stuff that we've already covered? Well, firstly, it was important. Eating and drinking with people was important to God and Jesus. Some of you guys would be familiar with this 1410 portrait of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit by Andrei Rublev. And you'll see here they're all gathered around a table. The three members of the Godhead gathered around a table. And this is a reminder that the very nature of God is companionship, self-giving love from one to another, and demonstrated in Jesus' incarnating, God becoming flesh, taking on flesh, becoming human. And just think about this. Becoming human necessitates having bodily appetites to fill. So Jesus becoming a man means that Jesus needed to eat and drink. Those of you who've been around for a while will be familiar with the verses contained in the Gospels that refer to Jesus as the Son of Man coming. So the Son of Man came to fill in the blank. So the Son of Man came not to serve, but to be served. Sorry, not to be served, but to serve. That one's pretty famous from Mark 10:45. Another famous one is the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost from Luke 19:10. Both pretty familiar. But perhaps more surprisingly, in Luke, we read that the Son of Man came eating and drinking. And this is interesting. As we just heard, Jesus' mission could be summarised as seeking and saving the lost. That's what he came to do. But the how? How did he actually go about that? Pre his crucifixion? The how seemed to involve a lot of eating and drinking with people. That's how he came to seek and save the lost. His public ministry began with his turning water into wine, that famous story. And interestingly, the water he used in that example, it had the official function of ceremonial washing for the Jews at the time. So if a Jew feared that they'd been made ceremonially unclean through contact with a non-Jew, a Gentile, they would use this specially set aside water to wash and make themselves ceremonially clean again. So the water's purpose was to highlight the divide effectively between Jews and non-Jews, Gentiles. And Jesus took this water and turned it into wine, a drink that is so often associated with hospitality and inclusiveness. In Jesus' time, Jews only broke bread, they only ate with their fellow Jews. Birds of a feather, so to speak, and a particularly religious feather at that. But Jesus, he broke those conventions. He ate with tax collectors, prostitutes, and non-Jews, Gentiles. His enemies accused him of being both a drunkard and a glutton. But this fellowship around a table and a meal, it was powerful. Aussie theologian Ben Myers, he has this great line that for Jesus, conversion flowered from communion. Conversion flowered from communion. So to paraphrase, spiritual transformation came out of communing around food and drink. Hospitality, if you like, came before spirituality. So we can think of Zacchaeus, a tax collector, a Jewish sellout, so to speak. It's around a meal with Jesus that he experiences a genuine spiritual transformation. But the hospitality, the welcoming, came first. And it's also at a table that Jesus revealed himself as Lord, as God, in Luke chapter 24, 28 to 32. And think of communion that we've celebrated this morning. Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. And do what? Eat and drink. Eat and drink. And for early Christians, this would have been a banquet. It would have been a bit more of a grander affair than we experience here week to week. So what the early Christians gathered around when they first met, it wasn't around a preacher to hear a cracking sermon. It wasn't around a rocking worship band to sing songs to. They gathered around a table and they ate and they drank. So that's the first reason. Eating and drinking was a really important part of Jesus' life. And secondly, it's really important to us as people, as creatures. Eating, being hungry, it shows that we're dependent. It highlights this big difference between creator and creature, between ourselves as image bearers of God and God himself. The need we feel to eat with others is also indicative of another dependency and appetite. We need company. All of us, admittedly to different degrees, but we all need company. You could be the world's biggest introvert and have all the streaming services known to man, even Paramount Plus, and a hyperspeed internet connection hooked up to a brand new Samsung 8G TV, for example. But eventually, you're going to want someone to share that stuff with. This struck me the other day. We recently visited the West Coast and we went to Sarah Island. So apparently Australia's oldest penal colony. So it predated Port Arthur. So we went and had a look around at Sarah Island. It was amazing. And then I was watching a little bit of the coronation last night, and it struck me that the same person way back in the 1800s could have ventured into Westminster Abbey and seen what effectively amounted to one of the 7 wonders of the world back then. I think something so grand and beautiful and ornate, and then made some really poor life decisions and done some horrible things, and ended up being shipped out to the bottom of the world, to this island, and then you go from one island, Tasmania, to another island, Sarah Island, and then if you were really bad at Sarah Island, the guy was telling us, then the ultimate punishment was this place called Grommet Rock. That's a little picture of Grommet Rock. So you're on a rock off the side of a small island, off the side of a slightly larger island, but still small island. And that was seen as the ultimate penalty. But our tour guide was saying, although you think that was like perhaps the worst that could happen to someone, Port Arthur was even worse than that. So you could be stuck side by side on this little rock with no shelter whatsoever, Grommet Rock, with a bunch of 6 or 7 other people at a time, in a context where the threat of cannibalism was real, and that still wasn't the worst thing that could happen to you. Our tour guide said the worst thing that could happen to you, and that Port Arthur made real, is solitary confinement. Prolonged periods of being stuck absolutely by yourself without any human company whatsoever. That's what broke people. That's what broke people. So it's a very real human appetite and need. We need company. We need other people. Our need to eat and drink, it's a good thing, not a bad thing. And it highlights our dependence on God and on others. From the farmer who grew the potatoes in Burnie to the 14-year-old who put together your Big Mac on the weekend. It also highlights our dependence upon nature. We are dependent creatures. Mike Frost, the Aussie theologian, he went as far as calling eating together the great leveller. The great leveller. It reminds us that despite our many and varied differences, we all have common human needs. What else is the importance of eating and drinking together? The German theologian and pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he gave some fantastic reasons for this. He oversaw a theological college back in the 30s, and he was an advocate for everyone, staff and students, sharing a meal together day in and day out. For Bonhoeffer, eating together was a way of remembering to recognise Jesus, both as the giver of physical daily bread, our food and drink. He's the creator and the source of all good things, so eating together reminds us of that. But it's also a daily reminder that ultimately all these things are for him as well, in the sense that we're given these good things. We're given our food and our drink, not primarily for our sake, but his, and for the carrying out of his purposes, to see his kingdom come, so to speak. And lastly on this, it's a way to recognise that Jesus is not just the giver of good things for his sake, but it's a reminder that he's the ultimate good thing. In other words, he's not just the bread, he's the bread of life, the bread of life. Bonhoeffer also wrote that the daily bread equivalent of meals is our bread. It's our daily bread as opposed to my daily bread. So if you look at the references in the Gospels, Matthew 6:11 and Luke 11:3, in the original Greek, the language there is our daily bread. Not yours, not mine, but our. And this reminds Christians of our duty to share our material resources, particularly food and drink, with each other. It's not just a spiritual connection, but a physical and material one. One bread for one body, it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10:17. We can't really try to compartmentalise our following of Jesus. If we violate our material obligations to each other, things as regular as food and company, then we're violating our spiritual obligations too. There's the famous parable in Matthew 25:37, when Christ said, "Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?' And the king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.'" Or James's famous injunction in chapter 2. "Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? I'll pray for you, it'll be fine." It's not enough if we can do more than that. God requires all of life discipleship, not just good intentions and offered prayers. And lastly, when it comes to the importance of this, Bonhoeffer stressed that eating is more than fueling up. Eating should be more than a pragmatic necessity. He would have been highly critical of the modern day meal replacements, the food in a jar that you can scoop up and powder into water and mix. He wrote that just eating together day to day is a reminder that life is not just drudgery, toil, and getting things done. It's actually a chance to stop, to give thanks, and enjoy the good gifts of God, like food and drink. He pointed to the famous Psalm 127 verse 2, "Eat your bread with enjoyment." Or Ecclesiastes, where the writer says, "I commend enjoyment, for there is nothing better for people under the sun than to eat and drink and enjoy themselves." Assuming, he also wrote, that God is part of this. Apart from him, he wrote, apart from God, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? God gives us the injunction to enjoy our food, to enjoy our drink. And then there's this great example from the Old Testament. You got Moses and Aaron and the 70 elders, the chiefs of the tribes of Israel. They ascend Mount Sinai to receive the commandments of God. And it says that they beheld God. They actually saw God's presence at the top of Mount Sinai. And they ate and they drank. Amazing. These humans, in the very presence of God, what did they do? Did they sing? No. Did they lay prostrate in the fetal position? No. They ate and drank, the most human of things to do. So Bonhoeffer says there's no place for eating with the attitude of, "I'm too busy and important for this base human function." There's no need to be feeling bad and guilty about those appetites. Instead, it's a chance to rejoice, to thank God and rejoice with each other. But like we read from Justin early Towns before, there's a flip, and we have to make a reverse flip. Eating with people on the regular, especially those who are outside the confines of the four walls that we live within, this is going to cause some inconvenience. It'll be costly in both time and dollars. It'll probably feel like some kind of impost. The necessary daily routine involves planning the meals, securing the ingredients, double-checking everyone's particular food and dietary preferences, ensuring that the kitchen is clean and clear to cook in, and then the serving after that, and the inevitable clearing and cleaning up afterwards. All of this on repeat, daily repeat. But perhaps the reason it feels this way, perhaps the reason why it feels like such a gross inconvenience, is because of our cultural context, the water that we swim in. I say that it views all this stuff as an intrusion at worst and a luxury at best. What I'm trying to argue this morning is that our cultural context has it all wrong in this regard. It's upside down. Being hospitable, creating an environment in which those under your roof and the relative stranger is welcomed and loved, having the opportunity to follow Christ's example of eating and drinking with people, of reminding each other of the true bread of life, and taking these little opportunities to celebrate. This is actually the stuff of life. It feels like an impost because our values are still a little bit upside down. Despite it being seemingly proven now that loneliness is a real epidemic, and despite being told again and again that social connections over time are one of the biggest factors in our well-being and quality of life, we still live otherwise. The ancients apparently used to refer to the household as a school of love. We create this welcoming and hospitable environment that involves food and drink. Why? Because it fosters love and meaningful connection. It demonstrates to the people under our roof that they actually matter, that they're made in the image of God. Is there anything more meaningful than that? If we don't have the time to prep, to clean up, then something else has slipped in and become more important. What are we conveying to the kids who live underneath our roof? That we're too busy for this. There are more important things than being hospitable. And usually those more important things, again, they're solitary or family accomplishments. And what are we setting up for the future? Our households, instead of becoming schools of love, can become schools of harriedness, and the constant striving to do and be more, to achieve, to keep up, to fly in the face of those crucial limits. Once again, the old lie. You will be like God, with no limits. That's the big lie. Instead, being hospitable and cultivating our homes as schools of love, this presents an opportunity to be a witness for God to those who are uncertain or even hostile to Christianity. Justin Early Towns again had this great quote in his book. I'm not sure if it's his or belongs to someone else, but he wrote, "Atheism is more of a mood than a conclusion, and more of a mood than a conclusion." People are understandably sceptical about Christianity. An excellent way to tackle that is not with an argument necessarily, although they may have their place, but not so much an argument as a presence. A hospitable, welcoming presence involving food and drink that takes place around a table. A light, he writes, in an increasingly dark and lonely world. That's what we can offer. So, to wrap up, some ideas for some practical application here. How do we actually go about this? Mike Frost, who many of you be familiar with, he had this great line that as followers of Jesus, we should be radical socialisers, referring to our generosity, the frequency of our socialisation, and also who we socialise with. So he actually advocates for eating with others 3 times a week. And it sounds like a lot, but again, he says, on average, most of us are going to have 21 meals a week. We could surely share 3 of these with others. So he recommends we eat at least once with someone from church, at least once with someone outside of church, and then the last one he's not so concerned with. It could be an extended family member, could be a single friend, doesn't matter, but 3 meals out of the 21, share those. And he talks about the idea of having people from outside our immediate family and church, that reflects a larger theme that we find all through Scripture, and that is the theme of adoption. So a little bit like we've heard about this morning already, God adopts us back into his family through Jesus. We're now his brothers and sisters, and we can mirror some of this generous adoption through our hospitality. I think the best chance of making something like this work is to, maybe I've run out of batteries up here. Do you mind hitting the slide, Graham? Is that okay? Thanks. The best chance of making something like this work is by building it into our weekly schedules, I'd suggest. If we don't build it into our weekly schedules, then we're going to have to keep on thinking about how we make it happen week in or week out. And that's going to be too draining. Instead, if we schedule it, then it just goes onto autopilot. It gets its own slot in the calendar. So it means realistically thinking, when is this most likely to happen? It's probably not going to be a Monday night if you're still working. It's probably not going to be a Friday or Saturday night because there's usually too many invitations that can come in. Maybe it'll be Sunday lunch. Maybe it'll be Thursday dinner. Maybe it'll be a Friday morning breakfast. These are just suggestions. It's about finding out what's most likely to be the most sustainable and realistic given your specific circumstances. Because the key is to keep it sustainable. And one way to go about that is to try to make it low drag. So people who talk about this, who write about this, they talk about doing something as simple as, say, a DIY pizza night. Something that's low prep, doesn't take that much preparation, but also good fun. And I'd suggest that we need to walk that line between knowing it's going to involve some work and preparation. Shouldn't be naive about that. But at the same time, being realistic about our creaturely limits. You could probably do something like put on a gastronomical extravagance week in and week out. And maybe you could do that once, twice, 3 times, but it's probably going to lead you to dreading it and becoming resentful. And dread and resentment don't square away well with hospitality. So it's working out ways to make it sustainable and doable. And it's also not having undue high expectations about fanciness and cleanliness. You don't want that kind of stuff to get in the way. You don't want people coming over thinking this place is a pigsty, but you don't want it detracting it from the experience either. You don't want people turning up and saying, I could never do the equivalent of your hospitality because it's so grand. And then there's the idea of rituals. Simple, repetitive things like prayers, saying grace around a meal, like lighting candles to make it that little bit kind of special. Or maybe having a set of questions that you ask to get some conversation going. The Bendels had this great little ritual of asking about the rose, the thorn, and the banana, which is great. So the rose, what's been good about your day? The thorn, what's been challenging about your day? And the banana, what's the funniest thing that's happened to you today? Some slapstick comedy. It's all there. So just having a set of questions that help, again, facilitate and encourage conversation. It's a great idea. But there are challenges, like I said. If you're not in a position to do this at your home at the moment, is it maybe too difficult, given who you're living with or a lack of space? Then maybe it's possible to make yourself a regular at someone else's place. If you can't be hospitable, you can still be part of someone else's hospitality, so to speak. And it's worth remembering we don't have to be the complete package. You don't have to be the chef, the host, the conversationalist. It's about finding people within our ranks that can complement each other's skill sets and gifts. Maybe you can cook, but you can't easily start a conversation to save yourself. It's a great opportunity to find that gregarious, outgoing, extroverted friend and invite them in to be part of it. So to conclude, I'd encourage you to think about this. It can seem a lot to aspire to, but again, I'd say it's worth it over the long haul because it fits with how we're built. It fits with the image of our Creator that we're trying to conform to. And it's a powerful, powerful thing. You might be surprised, like the number of visitors who we've talked to over the years, particularly if they come back and join. I'd say 75% of the time or more, one of the things they always mention that stood out to them when they first came to MCC is that someone asked them back for a meal afterwards. There's that little simple act of hospitality, of being so welcoming, goes a long way. I'm not sure if you read the Mercury, it must have been Wednesday or Thursday. Some of you guys would know Mike Dutta here. He was part of Murray Street in Hope back in the day. And for the last 14 years, he's been the owner of the food store in Macquarie Street Cafe, an institution. And it was interesting, you don't often know how valuable hospitality in that kind of hospitable environment is until it's taken away from you. And these guys can no longer afford the rent on their shop, so they're likely to lose it after 14 years. And this is what he wrote in the article about the purpose behind his cafe. It was like a church, but without the preaching, and instead a place to demonstrate love and compassion and Christian values through food and discussion. To me, this cafe has been a symbol of hope, a place where people can come together and find common ground regardless of their differences. And some of the regulars there, they went on to say in the article, it was a home, a refuge, and for some of us, it was a kind of church. This kind of environment we often take for granted, it means so much to people. It can be so powerful, such a tangible demonstration of God's love. Let's pray. Father, I pray that you'll help us mirror the way that your Son lived. Help us be followers of his way and not just people who think it's a great idea. Help us live lives where we have the time, most of all, the time to give to people, to open our homes and our houses if we have them, and to make people feel loved and welcomed. Help us shift our priorities if we have to. Help us just realise that we are actually built for connection. And that mirrors the very nature of God. And help us not get distracted and preoccupied with all the other demands in life, particularly those that are just tied up with striving and ambition and achievement. Help us love you and love the people that you've placed us amongst. Amen.